types in school and stuff. And always doing the right thing and taking care of everybody and everything. And here again, they're compulsively responsible. They have a good chance of developing workaholism as they get older, because they can't be okay unless out here is okay. But that's what you see on the outside. This kid that's doing well in school and very responsible and looking good. And on the inside, this kid doesn't feel all that good. On the inside, this kid feels not important, inadequate, alone, afraid, ashamed, and guilty. And so they compensate for all those feelings by overcompensating, by trying to prove they are worth something. Basically, on the inside, this kid feels worthless, like a piece of crap. And that's reinforced in the family over and over. And then second kid comes along, same problem, needs attention. This kid's got a little more of a challenge now, because he's got an older brother or sister already taking some of the attention. And plus that good kid role's not available. The older brother or sister's doing that. And this kid looks around and says, I can't compete with that. This kid doesn't care much about achieving. This kid just tends to get caught up in acting out and getting in trouble and hyperactive. This kid is the not so good kid, I call it. And he has a real good chance of getting caught up in gangs and getting in trouble and skipping school. You know, he doesn't care much about those kind of things because he can't compete. On the outside, he's the tough kid. And looks tough and like he don't care, you know, and that kind of stuff. But on the inside, just like his Badger State brother or sister, he feels exactly the same way. Not important, inadequate, alone, ashamed, guilty, and worthless. But this kid compensates by proving it and reinforces it. And so both these kids are out of touch with their powers as a person. And in my own experience, my wife and I met in high school. And we're both the oldest in our family. And she was National Honor Society. I was voted most likely 2 times my senior class. Because most of the time I wouldn't even show up. And if I did, the principal had a chair down in his office for me. And a lot of teachers kept one in the hall for me, because not only did I mess up by everybody else's education, not only did I mess up mine, I messed up everybody else's too. I was what they call a troublemaker. And here's the hook. Education's important to me. My master's degree is in education, and learning's important to me. I care a lot about learning. And one of the things, if you want to know what's important to families and kids, look at what they're sabotaged and screwing up. Because that's, you know, there's an old saying that God's first destroy those things that they care about the most. And that makes sense. If I don't like me and I start messing up something that's important to me, that's just going to hurt me more. You see what I'm saying? And that's not a conscious kind of thing. Remember, the imbalance is a troublemaker. He's always getting in trouble. And the kid needs attention, but he's more likely to get detention. And that's not going to help the kid, you know. And the last kid comes along, that's the youngest. They're in real trouble now, because wasn't a lot of attention to start with, and the first 2 roles already taken, so they got to figure out how to get some attention and what their role is going to be. But they've got something working for them. They're the youngest, and they're just so cute, and so they can get some attention that way. So this youngest kid is usually pretty hyper and clownish and entertains everybody, or else they're very withdrawn and cut off, and I call it trying to stay out of the line of fire. Because I call this last role the little trooper role, you know. It can be mascot or pet. That's some of the other names I've heard for it. And on the outside, they're just so cute. That's what you see. But on the inside, same thing. Feel like crap. Like I'm not important at all. And Marika always said crap rolls downhill. And guess who's at the bottom in this family, right? And so all these kids need some help. You have to see through the lie to the truth and help them with that. And they're all at high risk for legal problems and alcohol or drug abuse or dysfunctional relationships and all the kind of things that create problems and stress in people's lives, which just reinforces the stuff going on inside. A lot of times with this younger kid too, if it's a little girl, they'll dress her all up and try to make her look like a big girl and put her on display. Same way with little boys. They make you dress you all up and say, well, you got to act like a man and put you on display. What's the problem with that if you're little?
Pressure.
Pressure, but what do you got to be before you can get big?
Little.
Got to be little. And so what the message there is, it's not okay to be little. So you have to grow up quick. And so a lot of times some of your developmental things get kind of pushed aside and you're at a disadvantage that way too. So all these kids grow up and there's things other people know and they just don't have a clue about it. They just don't know things that everybody else knows. So they never feel like they fit in or belong or that they're okay. It's just an awful thing. I know it's just, working with kids, it really helped me because I grew up with a lot of stuff that wasn't real obvious and it makes it more dangerous. So we'll get to that too, I think. All right? Well, here you go. What about the kids? I said it's like putting a butterfly in a blender. Children, when they're in an addictive, abusive family, start out like a butterfly, and then they have to go into a cocoon and live a lie to survive. And even if you win that one, you lose. Because kids need attention and nurturing as much as they need food and clothes and shelter. In fact, they've done some research with rhesus monkeys where they gave them food and shelter and didn't give them attention. And some of them died. And it's called non-organic failure to thrive. Now, just failure to thrive is when you don't get what you need to survive. And this is not food and stuff. This is more like a non-organic. And depending on how sensitive you are, depends on how wounding it is. And so, I think I used the 3 R's to define how kids get hurt. The first one's the roles. We just went through that. And then the rules, we're going to talk about those. And the last one's the riff-off, the grief and loss, which is a basic component of growing up. And we'll get into some of those. Okay, let's start with the role. We talked about the good kid, not so good kid. I don't use the word bad kid because I don't think they're bad kids. I think they're just good at surviving. Okay. And I don't like that kind of shame label. They don't need that. And then the last one is the lost child or the family pet. By the way, if you ever want to find out which is which, go into a house sometime and you'll spot them right away. Because the good kid's up there talking to you about some project in school and something that they've been doing that's really important. And the not so good kid, they're always telling him to shut up and sit down. He's over making trouble and stuff. And the lost child, the little trooper, when you leave, you won't even remember that kid. That kid just kind of blended into the woodwork somewhere, right? And so, if you're paying attention, you'll see those things. And and that, in some ways, that blending into a woodwork is not a lot more wounding than some of the other two, I think. What's a good kid role look like? I went through these. They learn the rules, they're good at obeying them, compulsively responsible, they're at danger of becoming a human doing as opposed to a human being. Mm-hmm. Not so good kid role, can't compete with that good kid. So they don't care about achieving or competing. So they find their own role. And they need attention, but like I say, they're likely to get detention. And here again, this little trooper tends to withdraw and are be hyper. They're clownish and they're so cute. Often dressed up, put on display, and expect to act older and beyond their age. A big girl or boy can impair their developmental potential. All right. Now, what about the roles? Oh, by the way, and these roles are also very fixed and they're very rigid. And once you get caught up in one, it's really hard to break out of it. And if you don't recognize it, you can take it right into your adult life, and it can cause you a lot of problems there too. So starting to understand these roles and change them is very important, I think, when you grow up in this situation. And first of all, in terms of the rules, healthy families have validating rules. Healthy families tend to teach principles, life principles. And in a healthy family, the family exists for the individual. In unhealthy family, the rules tend to be invalidating and generally shaming and demeaning. And they tend to teach and enforce rules. In a dysfunctional family, the individual exists for the family. Can you see the difference in whether you feel okay or what's important in your life? In the location of control there. Now, where do the rules come from? Each generation has rules, and they get passed on to the next generation, usually without any question. A lot of the rules we grow up predate that our current generation and can go back decades. Like I say, they get passed on without question, whether they serve their original purpose or not, or the current purpose. Good example of men don't feel, nor they think that rule goes back to. They think that rule goes back to the Middle Ages, when men had to go around during the plague and gather up all the bodies and burn them. And in that situation, feelings were a liability. It's not unlike people who were in war zones. When I was in Vietnam, I just had to shut down feelings because they were a liability. And so you just don't feel. And women being caretakers, that was always the woman's job, to take care of everybody. And I've had a number of women who I've worked with, who were codependent, and then they went on to become nurses and things like that. And they said, well, heck, I've been doing it all my life. I finally figured out I might as well get paid for it. Rules are important because they provide parameters within which to operate. They help us know where and how to belong in our environment. They contribute to a sense of safety and security by providing an external structure. Rules help us define our world. They provide a criteria for determining our morals and our values. Rules apply to doing versus principles which apply to being. And so healthy families teach you how to be okay instead of being concerned about whether you're doing okay or not. And one of the things I've seen, and this is not across the board, is a lot of times your first kids, your good kids, are very rule-oriented, and they function really well in school and places because of the structure and everything is defined for them. But then when they get out of school and have to get out in the world where a lot of times there are no rules, and where there's a lot of variation, they have a harder time and they tend to withdraw and tend to be more anxious. And they have all that stuff they had going for them all of a sudden doesn't help them because they don't know what to do with it. So they tend to withdraw and shut down and run back to trying to do what they can't do. Here we go. Now, healthy rules are safe and validating. I never grew up with many of these, but there are people that do. They're supportive and allow you to make mistakes. And not knowing and being human is encouraging. Now, in my wife's family, when you made a mistake, you got ridiculed and shamed. So even now for her, anytime she doesn't know what to do, she either gets defensive or shuts down because she's afraid if she's going to do it wrong or not be able to do it. And then that triggers that shame stuff. So yeah. You have a right to experience and express feelings. And safe rules give you the right to have needs and be needy. And in addictive families, a lot of times, if you have a need, that gets shamed. So then as you get older, anytime you feel a need, you feel shame. So it's hard to allow yourself to be needy. And yet we are. That's how we're built. Feeling valued and safe and cared about is just kind of how you feel in your family. That just kind of comes with the deal. The expression of curiosity and trust is promoted. It's okay to ask questions and want to know about things, as well as it's okay not to know. They prohibit humanness through shame, blame, demeaning physical, verbal, and nonverbal expression. They are comparative. When they compare you to your siblings, and you're always not enough. They discount your own value and worth. Unhealthy rules include, now if some of these look familiar to you, it's okay, let me know. And some of you have your own rules. And I think it's important to know what kind of rules you grew up with, and then to determine whether they're still valid or whether they're still adequate or something that works for you, or whether you need to discount those and develop some new rules to help you in your life in the present. And here again, you should be seen and not heard. Do as I say, not as I do. You should never have been born. You were a mistake. Wouldn't that be an awful thing to say to a little kid? You're not important or worth caring about. And that root is so very wounding. You'll never amount to anything. I heard that a lot growing up. All you're good for is eating and sleeping. I heard that a lot growing up too. And that came, I think, from my dad's experience with his dad, who did the same number on him. Because here again, these things just keep going until you break the cycle. And big boys, big girls don't cry. I'll give you something to cry about. You know what? Kids don't cry unless there's a reason. And when they cry, it's because there's something wrong. And it's important to take some time to try to figure out what that is and help them work through it and deal with it and understand it. Well, that's how you made sense out of, my guess, not feeling valued or getting attention. And the nonverbals can be just as significant as the verbal sound. You hear what they're not saying sometimes.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And that can be just as wounding, yeah. But and kids are very intuitive about it. They have to be to survive. They're very intuitive about whether something's safe or not, and whether somebody cares about them or don't. I had a mentor years ago always said, when you're really angry, look at how many dogs or kids come around you. And dogs and animals are the same way in a lot of ways. They're very intuitive, and you don't have to tell them. When you come in and you're angry and frustrated and got a lot of negative stuff going on, they just stay the hell away from you. That's what I'm saying. And as kids, we learn that too. But this is more than just a person. You know, when you're a kid, you idealize your parents. You can't not do that. They're your survival figure. They're like God. And so when you get if you got these messages from God, you could not blame yourself for that. You can't blame them. So it must be something wrong with me. Is how we make sense out of it. And that's shame. And then we continue to develop that in ways to help us try to understand it. Or we don't talk about our problem. So you get the idea that whatever's wrong is something that you don't talk about. In fact, I heard a little kid say one time, she said, when you have these rules, she said, they're not just rules, they're like laws. Right. So you can't break them.
That last one hits it right on the
Did that
You
nail?
don't talk.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the don't talk rule. You can't trust others. And if you're coming from a family with a parent who's had problems in relationship with a male or a female, that's the message you get. The damn women, you know, they just out to steal your money and take advantage of you. You can't trust them. And those damn men the same way. They're just going to use you and leave you. So, and what kind of message does that give a kid when they go out and try to have relationships? See, their trust is already down the tubes to some extent, and so that puts them in a real bind. So yeah. Or that's a dumb way to feel, think, or act. You know, so that shames whatever you're doing. It makes you question yourself. I think the most wounding rules are ones that say you're not important and you're not, and we don't care about you. When you grow up with those two rules, it's really hard to feel like you're worthwhile, especially if that's coming from your survivor figure. Then there's the deadly, I call it the deadly triad, and you mentioned that. There's the don't talk, the don't trust, and the don't feel rule. And when you grow up with those rules and you're playing the game by those rules, you're going to be in a big world of hurt. So it's important to look at those and determine if maybe I don't have to keep playing by those rules. Now the third are the rip-offs. Those are all the losses you grow up with. And kids grow up, and all addicts, grief is a basic reaction to any addiction. There's a guy named Jody Kelman wrote a little book that said grief is a basic reaction to alcohol. And he said, and all family members live with a chronic underlying sense of grief at all times. Because there's a lot, and here again, their reaction for both the addict and the family, those close to him or her. And grief is the experience of loss. Mourning is the expression of it. So we not only need to experience our losses, we need to mourn it, we need to get it out. And that's impaired by our culture. And that's just my hypothesis on what underlies addictive relationship and addictions. And that a big piece of it is misdiagnosed or undiagnosed underlying issue is chronic grief and loss and complex trauma issues. There's a type of grief called complicated grief that we'll get to that is addictive in and of itself. Addictive behaviors are grief and loss-based subconscious behavioral expression of significant unresolved personal and emotional loss. I know particularly with gambling, there's a theory that says that that's why gamblers gamble and lose. That's that's an expression of a lot of their grief and loss issues. And there's some research that supports that. But all addicts lose. We lose a lot. We'll get to some of that. Plus, the neurophysiology of addiction is triggered on the winning and losing side. Most addictive grief is ambiguous. And ambiguous means it's not real obvious. So it's often not validated as a loss by others, And that leads to uncertainty. For example, when you come out of your family and you're the good kid and you look like you're doing really well and you start talking about feeling a lot of loss, people are going to say, what you talking about? You did good. You did okay. You're not sad. What's that about? And so it's not as obvious as having somebody hit you with a truck, you know. So it creates uncertainty, and it may lead to chronic, complicated grief. Another term for it is traumatic. Chronic traumatic grief is complicated grief that repeats itself, possibly with greater intensity, with each new loss. And by the way, grief is cumulative in losses, and they keep accumulating till you deal with them. And they don't go away. It's enduring for years. It can trigger intense yearnings, preoccupation, and reminders of the loss trigger brain reward circuits in the nucleus accumbens, which is exactly what addictive behavior does. It releases dopamine, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that marks a behavior as being survival enhancing. And it makes it pleasurable. And this may interfere with adapting to the loss in the present, and also with grieving it. You know, our culture has some myths that impair the mourning process. And one of them is, it's not okay to show you grief. There's something I call the Mrs. Lincoln response. You familiar with that one? Yeah, that's the kind of says to Mary Lincoln when she's coming forward. Other than that, how'd you like to play? And the most common in our culture, when we see somebody in significant pain after a loss, what do you say to them? Are you all right? Are you okay? And to me, the answer is not only no, but hell no. Right? But and we've learned how to play that game, because what's our response to that?
Fine.
I'm fine. Because what I'm really saying is, your emotional pain is very threatening and discomforting to me. So if I ask you if you're okay and you tell me you are, now I don't have to feel so anxious and uncomfortable. But I also just said to you, it's not okay for you to feel that pain. That somehow there's something wrong for you to do that. And so I can think that gets in the way of mourning. You can, there's no particular time limit on it. What can happen is you can do some work on it, but grief some of it never goes away. And when it gets triggered, it's experiential. So you don't remember the loss, it puts you right back into it. So you have to re-grieve some of it again. It triggers it again. And you have to re-grieve it. And I think it's important to give yourself permission to do that. And that's the other myth in our culture, is that you get over it. What, you still dealing with that stuff? That was 2 years ago. You ought to be all better by now. That's not necessarily true. Well, yeah, there was a time when you didn't do that. You just had to be tough and suck it up and get on with things. But you got to decide if that's where you want to continue to perpetuate that. You know, and in my mom's case, it was her mom dying when she was young, you know, and never got over that. And just avoided it. And anytime something would come up around a loss, she would just shut it down and not deal with it. And it was very confusing, and I learned that wasn't okay until I learned better and started doing that work. I agree you don't want to live there, but you need to be willing to go back and deal with it when it comes up again. And you need to have the tools and safe people and places to do that.
Feelings buried alive.
Yeah, and if you don't get them out in a healthy way, they come out sideways, and that ain't pretty sometimes. And that's what you see a lot with addictions and crazy relationships and even crazy behavior, you know. So so one myth is it's not okay to feel it. The other is you should be over it by now. And when it comes up again, it doesn't mean you haven't done some work on it. It just means it's still there and there's some more work to do. It's like the Wisconsin winter. You know, when I go out and shovel, yeah, I got it all cleaned up, but when it comes back, it doesn't mean I didn't shovel the last time. It just means I got more shoveling to do, right? But as long as I have what I need to do it, then I can manage it. And this is a very interesting thing. I just recently learned about this idea of complicated grief. And complicated grief is prolonged, unabated grief. It differs from normal grief in that it includes a pain related to social pain of loss. It triggers reward activity related to attachment behavior, resulting in activation of reward circuits in the nucleus accumbens, which is your pleasure center in the brain. That's where the addictions trigger. The nucleus accumbens was possibly correlated with self-reported yearnings and reminders of the lost relationship. So every time that comes up, it triggers reward circuits. It includes debilitating recurrent pangs of painful emotions, intense yearning, searching for and preoccupation with thoughts of the loss. I have a cousin whose daughter was killed in a car accident when she was 16, and that was probably 40 years ago. She still struggles with it. This is a great quote. And this is complicated. There is no pain so great as the memory of joy in the present of grief. So this is new knowledge, you know. They didn't know what it was, but he knew how it felt. And it can impair the grieving process and be very confusing and make it more difficult. And losses are both tangible and intangible. Tangible, as you know, is something that's pretty obvious. Intangible, I think, in some ways, are even more significant because they're not so obvious. Let's look at some of the addict's tangible losses here. Property and jobs, relationships and family, driver's license and freedom, health and physical abilities, addictive lifestyle. Now, a lot of people don't think about that, but that can go both under tangible and intangible. You got to remember that addict identity was real important to him. And it's like, you know, when you're an addict, your addiction is like your best friend. Now non-addicts don't understand that. You know, and when you lose, it's like giving up your best friend. You know, for me, that's like me and green beans. I don't have a primary relationship with green beans, so if I don't eat them, I don't feel like I've lost my best friend. And so that makes it more ambiguous for people, you know. Okay, and for the significant others, the tangible losses are relationships, family, material items, economic security, personal freedom, life choices, physical health. Your caretaker identity is the same as the addict identity, because that's how you defined yourself, from out here, not from in here. And so if I can't take care of you, well, you know, I ain't worth it. That's a big loss. That's a big part of my identity and my whole, what's been important to me in life and how I give myself credibility and validated myself. And that's a big loss. Intangible losses for the addict tend to be more ambiguous. Serenity, peace of mind. How about hopes, dreams? The loss of what could have been. That's a fairly significant loss, I think. Self-worth and esteem. How about a safe childhood? The loss of having a childhood. That's a fairly significant loss. Intimate relationships with parents and loss of your true self. and the self-worth and self-esteem that goes with that. And here again, these are the things people aren't going to see. When you start grieving things like your safe childhood and not having parents that were there for you that you connect with, and your addict identity, most people aren't going to have a clue about that. You ought to be grateful you got the hell out of there. They wasn't that bad. You're going to definitely get some Mrs. Lincoln responses from that one. And some of these just never go away. Significant others, you'll see some intangible, ambiguous, the safety and security. Hopes, dreams, what could have been. Most co-addicts, when they got in a relationship with this person, and they didn't expect it would end up like it did. And that hurts. Safe childhood, intimate relationships with significant others, including your relationship with your true self, that butterfly. Losing that butterfly is a significant loss, I think. And that caretaker identity, because that was, like I say, that was you. And that was like your best friend. You know, well, you see, my bias is none of this says anything about you as a person. This is about what happened to you. And you are the same person now as you were then and you would have been. And understanding who that is and living your life from your true self is going to work a lot better for you. Instead of the shame self and all the, instead of making what happened to you and how you were treated the criteria for whether you're okay or not. Nobody can be okay from there. I think you need to look at that as that was what was wrong, and that it's different from me. And so my challenge is to better define me and start grounded from there. And here again, restore that butterfly, that inner balance, and my powers as a person, and grow from there. And the good news is you can do it. The bad news is it's probably about a 60-year project. Okay. Here again, working through this process, I think, is a vital part of recovery, but something that's not often recognized, and a lot of times it's ignored and are undiagnosed and misdiagnosed because people see this a lot of times and it routinely gets misdiagnosed as depression, because I'll talk about this in a week when we talk about detachment and grieving. The deep limbic effects of grief on our limbic system parallel the symptoms of clinical depression. And so, the old rule was that way you differentiated grief from depression was that grief doesn't last a long time. That after a certain amount of time, the grieving's gone, but with depression it's going to be there. I don't think that's necessarily true. I've seen grief last for years. And the problem with that is, if it's depression, the medication is appropriate. But if it's grief, it's contraindicated, because the only way out of grief is through it. I need to experience it and mourn it. And if you medicate me, that's going to impair that. That's what addicts have done for years, self-medicated that, right? Exactly, yeah. And so I think it's important to differentiate it. And when I work with clients, particularly addicts, and they came in, and I saw what looked like depression, I would assume it was grief. And the most common diagnosis for addicts and alcoholics is depression and anxiety. But when you think about depression, it's just another word for feeling sad. And anxiety is another word for being scared. And I used to tell my guys, based on where you've been, I'd be worried about you if you weren't sad and scared.